are operating as though the United States is in a vacuum. It is important to keep in mind that the Energy Information Administration projects that by 2030, 80% of global energy demands, 80%, are going to be addressed using fossil fuels. This is the Energy Information Administration, not some type of partisan hack group. 80%. Yet just last week, we had 3 bills designed to stop energy production in the United States. Over the weekend, we have a tax in Saudi Arabia. All that does is increase our reliance upon energy sources from other countries that have a lower safety standard and have a lower environmental standard. Records show, it is crystal clear, that when we import energy from other places, we actually increase the risk to the environment, increase the risk of spills than when we have domestic energy production. I hear people talking about how we need to stop all fossil fuel utilization and stop all these emissions. Right now, as was stated, for every 1 ton of carbon emissions we've reduced in the United States, China has increased by 4 tons, more than offsetting all the reductions that we've had in the United States. Moving forward, even under the Paris Accords that folks are sitting here giving accolades to and saying is a great idea, and I want to be clear, I support the U.S.'s target in the Paris Accords. I think that signing on to an agreement and agreeing to something that allows for China to come in and have a 50% increase, adding another 5 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions annually by 2030 is inappropriate. It is moving in the wrong direction, not in the right direction. I also remain confounded reading letters like this one that says that we need to pressure the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and Cooperating Countries to increase world oil supplies in order to lower prices at the pump. The impact of rising fuel prices on our economy and on family budgets is significant and widespread. This letter goes on to say, the current run-up in world oil prices is effectively a tax on all American families' discretionary budget, except that the money goes to OPEC as opposed to the United States Treasury. So let me say again, this letter is advocating for increased world oil production because prices are too high. Who do you think signed this letter? Who do you think signed this letter? Think about it for just a minute. Put a name in your head. This letter was sent by Senator Cantwell, Senator Menendez, Senator Chuck Schumer, and Senator Ed Markey just last year. I remain so confused by what it is that we're doing. What is our policy? And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that this be included in the record. Look, my home state is at risk of its existence moving forward with sea rise. But we've got to make sure that we're moving forward in a rational manner that builds on successes and corrects failures, rather than these confounding policies that make no sense. Yield back.
Well, thank you. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Greta Thunberg is from Sweden. She's a climate activist who helped build the Fridays for Future movement, where she began going on strike from school outside the Swedish Parliament on Fridays. She has spoken on the climate crisis before the EU Parliament. Welcome. Ms. Jamie Margolin is from Seattle, Washington. She's co-founder of the co-executive and co-executive director of the 0 Hour, an international youth climate organization founded in the summer of 2017. She's also a plaintiff in Piper v. State of Washington. Mr. Vic Barrett is from White Plains, New York. He's a fellow with the Alliance for Climate Education and a plaintiff in Juliana versus United States. Welcome. Mr. Benji Backer is from Appleton, Wisconsin. He's the president of the American Conservation Coalition, a nonprofit organization to educate and engage conservatives on climate change. All of you are here. We welcome all of you. We appreciate your efforts. Please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. I'll now go to Ms. Thunberg for her statement.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I have not come to offer any prepared remarks at this hearing. I'm instead attaching my testimony. It is the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the SR 1.5, which was released on October 8th, 2018. I am submitting this report as my testimony because I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to the scientists. And I want you to unite behind the science. And then I want you to take real action. Thank you.
Tack så mycket. Ms. Margolin.
My name is Jamie Margolin, and I'm a 17-year-old climate justice activist from Seattle, Washington. I'm missing a lot of school to be here. It's my senior year of high school. I have college application deadlines looming over me, and to be honest, I've barely even started because I'm too busy fighting to make sure that I'm actually going to have the future I'm applying to study for. You're here spending a few moments with me, but that is nothing compared to the hours that members of Congress have spent with lobbyists from corporations that make billions of dollars off of the destruction of my generation's future. I want the entirety of Congress, in fact, the whole US government, to remember the fear and despair that my generation lives with every day, and I want you to hold on to it. How do I even begin to convey to you what it feels like to know that within my lifetime, the destruction that we have already seen from the climate crisis will only get worse? What adds insult to injury is the fact that we keep getting promised what isn't there. On college applications, I keep getting asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? The media, pop culture, businesses, and the whole world tells me that I and my whole generation will have something to look forward to that we just don't. You're promising me lies. Everyone who will walk up to me after this testimony saying that I have such a bright future ahead of me will be lying to my face. It doesn't matter how talented we are. It doesn't matter how much work we put in, how many dreams we have. The reality is, my generation has been committed to a planet that is collapsing. The fact that you are staring at a panel of young people testifying before you today, pleading for a livable earth, should not fill you with pride. It should fill you with shame. Youth climate activism should not have to exist. We are exhausted because we have tried everything. We've built organizations, organized marches, and worked on political campaigns. I sued my state government in a lawsuit called Piper versus the State of Washington, along with 12 other plaintiffs, for contributing to the climate crisis and denying my generation's constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property. The lawsuit is also arguing that the natural resources of my state are protected as a right under the Washington State Constitution. The shellfish, salmon, orcas, and all of the beautiful wildlife of my Pacific Northwest home is dying due to ocean acidification caused by the climate crisis, and communities all over Seattle are suffering from the new fossil fuel infrastructure being built to lock in decades more of climate destruction into my state. My friends and I were warned to stay inside the last 2 summers because our city was shrouded in a suffocating smoke from wildfires. It gave me such bad headaches for so long, and my friends with respiratory illnesses had to go to the ER. Is this the future that we have to look forward to? Well, we the youth are working as hard as we can to make sure that it isn't. On July 21st of 2018, after an entire year of nonstop organizing, despite being full-time high school students with a lot of homework to do, my organization, 0 Hour, marched on Washington, D.C. in a pouring rainstorm and in 25 cities around the world, demanding urgent climate action from you and all of our leaders. And that was only the beginning. But by 2030, we will know if we have created the political climate that will have allowed us to salvage life on Earth, or if we acted too late. By then, we must be well on the path to climate recovery, but this must start today. In fact, it should have started yesterday. By 2030, I will be old enough to run for Congress and be seated right where you guys are sitting right now. By then, we need to have already achieved net zero greenhouse gas emissions and be rapidly on the path to climate recovery. I can't wait until I'm sitting in your seats to change the climate crisis. You have to use the seats that you have now, because by the time I get there, it's going to be way too late. The good news is that experts agree that there are multiple pathways to decarbonize the United States energy system, and that doing so is both technologically and economically viable and beneficial. The most frustrating thing is that the US government can't even begin to imagine the massive political shift that has to happen in order for us to solve this issue. The politics just hasn't been invented yet. Solving the climate crisis goes against everything that our country was unfortunately built on: colonialism, slavery, and natural resource extraction. This is why the youth are calling for a new era altogether. As Greta mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that we only have a few months left in order to create the massive political shift needed to transition our world to an entirely renewable energy economy. This needs to happen within the next 10 years, which is our deadline to save life as we know it. People call my generation Generation Z, as if we are the last generation, but we are not. We are refusing to be the last letter in the alphabet. I am here before the whole country today, announcing that we are instead Generation GND, the generation of the Green New Deal. The only thing that will save us is a whole new era. The Green New Deal is not just about the specific plans laid out in resolutions, it's about a new chapter in American history and transforming our culture into one that celebrates, encourages, and enables radical climate action. It is right here, testifying before you, that I'm proud to announce that history is being made. You've heard of the Reagan era, the New Deal era. Well, the youth are bringing about the era of the Green New Deal.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
My name is Vic Barrett. I'm 20 years old, and I'm one of the 21 youth plaintiffs in the Juliana versus United States constitutional lawsuit, suing the executive branch of the federal government for knowingly causing climate change. I'd like to recognize my fellow co-plaintiffs in this room sitting behind me. I'm a first-generation Garifuna American. My people are an Afro-Indigenous community originally from the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. In the 18th and 19th centuries, we were pushed from our homeland on St. Vincent by British colonial power, settling on the eastern coast of Central America in Honduras and Belize. Despite overwhelming adversity, we organized our community and emancipated ourselves to protect our future as a people. However, the struggle continues for me and my people. As temperatures increase, sea levels rise, storms become more intense and frequent, and the coral reefs and fisheries upon which we depend disappear, the oceanfront land that my family has inhabited for generations and that I'm supposed to inherit will be underwater if the US federal government continues to promote a fossil fuel-based energy system. It is not just me and my people in Honduras being harmed by climate change. Frontline communities around the country and around the world are already feeling the effects of the climate crisis, from the dispossession of land to the grave public health threats that are disproportionately affecting myself and other young people. These frontline communities are made up of people who look like me: young, Black, and brown, LGBTQ, Indigenous, identities which place them at a significantly higher risk to experience the impacts of climate change than the general populace due to their marginalized status in our society. I myself have felt the consequences of climate change directly. Growing up in New York, I was impacted by the climate change-fueled Hurricane Sandy, which left my family and school without power for days. I still experience grave anxiety about experiencing another climate-driven disaster like Superstorm Sandy and the harm that these storms will have on myself and my family. As someone who already struggles with anxiety and struggles with depression from my understanding of climate change and what I experience, watching our government knowingly perpetuate the climate crisis is extremely overwhelming. I wrestle with this anxiety every day, from the moment that I wake up in the morning to the moment I fall asleep at night. If we keep going on with business as usual, both Honduras and New York, the places where my family and I are from, will forever be lost to the sea. That is one of my greatest fears, that climate change is going to take these places away from us. My co-plaintiffs also experience both the mental and physical health impacts of climate change. My co-plaintiffs with asthma and allergies have suffered from the prolonged wildfire and allergy seasons in the West, limiting their ability to participate in certain activities or even go outside. Many of them, like me, are also struggling with psychological harms from climate change. The medical community now recognizes climate change as a grave public health threat. One of our experts describes climate change as a public health emergency, which is disproportionately impacting children and youth in a myriad of ways. He lists specific health threats exacerbated by climate change, including heat stress, extreme weather events, wildfires, decreased air quality, and infectious disease, all of which pose a disproportionate threat to children and to youth. Another one of our experts, Dr. Lies van Susteren, a psychiatrist known nationally for her work on climate change, explains that, quote, with continued government actions that exacerbate the climate crisis, the plaintiffs and those they represent will suffer catastrophic emotional injuries. She goes on to state that the federal government's, quote, sanctioning of climate change as lawful in federal law and policy makes the psychological injuries suffered by individuals, including the plaintiffs, particularly harmful and insidious. She warns that without immediate action by the federal government to address climate change, the mental health impacts will worsen and be lifelong. Just as my federal government sanctioned discrimination in schools and housing until the middle of the last century, a policy that harmed children, my federal government has also orchestrated and sanctioned a system of fossil fuel energy that is harming children in another way, irreversibly threatening our health, our personal security, our homes, and our communities by recreating a dangerous climate system. Like youth who have come before us in the civil rights movement and other social justice movements, it is often the youth that must shine a light on systems of injustice. So in 2015, 21 young people, myself included, filed a lawsuit against the United States and agencies of the executive branch to safeguard our constitutional right to life, liberty, and property, including our rights to personal security, bodily integrity, and a stable climate system that sustains our lives and liberties. I was born into a world in which my future and my past are uncertain, born into a world where my culture and inheritance are literally slipping into the sea, born into a world where my people are going extinct. Show children everywhere that you care about our future and the future of all generations to come. Now is your time to stand in solidarity with me and my co-plaintiffs, America's youth, and communities around the world to fight for a just future free from catastrophic climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Backer.
Good morning. My name is Benji Backer, president and founder of the American Conservation Coalition, a nonprofit focused on bolstering conservative voices in environmental discussions. I'm also a 21-year-old senior at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I would like to thank Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Kinzinger, Chairman Castor, and Ranking Member Graves for holding this very important hearing. I'm also honored to share this panel with Greta, Vic, and Jamie. Each of you have played a critical role in generating worldwide awareness around this issue of climate change, so thank you. I'm a lifelong conservative activist, but like most of my generation, regardless of political affiliation, I believe climate change is real. I believe humans are making an impact. And with global emissions rising 1.7% last year, we're at a crossroads in history. My generation doesn't care about the politics around climate change. We want productive discussions, realistic answers, and sound policies. Most importantly, I believe America plays a vital role in solving this problem and that we must lead by example. Between 2005 and 2017, as already mentioned, we led the world in emissions reductions, more than the next 12 countries combined. However, while our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is declining, we still contribute nearly 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is second most in the world. However, Americans have been told that one-size-fits-all approaches, such as the Green New Deal, are the only solution. Such policies advocate for an economic transformation that increases government control, spending, and regulation. These approaches inhibit innovation and are not an effective way to reduce emissions. In fact, countries with highly restrictive and government-controlled economies like Venezuela have disastrous environmental records. And while on the other hand, countries leading in emissions reductions have some of the freest economic systems in the world. We can't ignore this reality. And the fact of the matter is, we cannot regulate our way out of climate change. Markets and competition reduce emissions far more than heavy-handed regulation. A truly effective climate plan will capitalize on America's strengths, technological advancements, empowered consumers, entrepreneurial businesses, effective government, and bold global leadership. We need to decarbonize fossil fuel emissions, increase the number of nuclear and hydropower plants, continue developing solar and wind, and encourage research and development into other clean energy technologies. It's easier to export innovative American technologies than burdensome regulations to developing nations. We must also understand the privilege Americans bring into this conversation. Across the globe, those who can most easily adapt to climate change are wealthy and live in developed countries. It's unfair to ask someone to make choices based on sustainability when they're struggling to survive. As we transition to cleaner energy landscapes in the United States and abroad, We need to consider the most vulnerable in our world. There are still over 1 billion people without electricity worldwide. Transitioning to clean energy needs to happen, but it can't happen overnight. Climate change conversations are often dominated by hopelessness and despair. In reality, fighting climate change is an opportunity to improve human health, lift people up, and grow the economy. And I see promising signs. Many bipartisan climate-related bills have been introduced and passed in the last 2 years. We're reducing emissions and creating remarkable new technologies. More Republicans are speaking up than ever before. This innovation-based approach is not limited to the United States either. Just yesterday, the British Conservation Alliance, a group inspired by my organization, the ACC, was launched by students in the United Kingdom to advocate for market-based environmental reforms. We're making strides in the right direction, but we must do more. Each of us play a critical role in tackling climate change. To my fellow conservatives, the climate is changing. It's time to claim our seat at the table and develop smart, limited government policies to establish American leadership on this issue. There is a reasonable, conservative approach to climate change, and we need to embrace it. To those on the left, without your leadership, this would not be receiving the attention that it deserves. But now, it's time for solutions. Politicizing climate change has deepened the partisan divide and delayed real action. If you truly want to address climate change, work with conservatives who want to champion reforms. To Congress, on climate change, it's not about Republicans or Democrats. It's about those who are taking effective action and those who are not. Our conversations on climate change should be about cutting global greenhouse gas emissions, not about political pandering. To President Trump, climate science is real. It's not a hoax. It's accepted that humans are having a negative impact on our climate. As a proud American, as a lifelong conservative, and as a young person, I urge you to accept climate change for the reality it is and respond accordingly. We need your leadership. And lastly, to young people, you have remarkable power. The 4 of us testifying up here today are all under the age of 22. The world is listening with open ears and hearts to our voices and voices just like yours. Stand for what you believe in, uplift the world, and don't back down. Climate change is about our future, and people need to hear you and us. In conclusion, I grew up on the shores of Lake Minocqua in northern Wisconsin, where I connected with the outdoors early in life. Nature is where I find the most peace and calm within myself. That's why I founded the American Conservation Coalition, to fight for wild places and stop climate change from destroying them. The health of the environment affects all of us, regardless of where we live, our background, or our political affiliation. It's time for Americans to join together, find solutions on climate change, and protect our planet for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank all the witnesses for their testimony and their urgency. It came through in all of your testimony. I now recognize myself for less than 5 minutes so that we can get as many people to ask questions as possible. I'll start just with Ms. Thunberg. You chose to submit the IPCC report in lieu of your written testimony. Could you expand on why it's so important to listen to the science?
Well, I don't see a reason to not listen to the science. It's just such a thing that we should be taking for granted, that we listen to the current best available united science. It's just something that everyone should do. This is not political opinions, political views, or my opinions. This is the science. So, yeah.
Thank you. In all of your testimony, not just urgency came through when I was listening to what you had to say, but as someone from another generation listening, the last thing we would want for the generations to follow, for our children, grandchildren, and other people's children and grandchildren, is to hear in some of your remarks actual fear and anxiety being expressed. Could you, each of you, that you can jump right in as you see fit, comment on what that's like? I think that that message should be heard by all of us, not just urgency, but what are we doing to the next generation? How are their lives impacted by what we're not doing and what we're doing. So if you could, I'll let you just choose among yourselves. Each of you will have a chance to answer that question.
For me, it's really been affecting, because similar to Vic, I already have like underlying issues of like anxiety, and it's just really hard to grow up in a world full of ifs. You know, I don't think a lot of people in Congress understand the conversations that are happening in everyday American high schools, but we're constantly asked, prepare for your future, study for your future, do this for your future. But our world is full of ifs. I'll be talking to my best friend and she'll be like, yeah, you know, I really want to see this natural place sometime if it's going to still be around. I really want to study to be this if that's still going to be a possibility. And it's just like this constant looming uncertainty, and it's this weird form of nihilism and weird just fear that's been existing in my generation, where kids are joking like, what is even like the point? The world is ending. What are we studying for? What are we doing? And it's this kind of depression. It's this fear that is not just among me or my panelists here, but everyone. And that anxiety is something that no child should ever have to fear. Because if you think about it, if you go back to what is the purpose of a parent, down to just the biological purpose, it's to give their child the best future and the best life that they can possibly have. And the supposed American dream is to make sure that children have a better future than the adults. But right now, it's like some members of government and some corporations are actively pointing a gun to children's futures and actively making it worse, actively going out of their way to support corporations and poison us and destroy our future. And that is horrifying, and it feels like a betrayal. It's like a knife to the heart to know that people who have kids, they'll go around in these campaign ads and they'll be like holding these babies like, oh, you should vote for me, look at me interacting with a small child, while they actively poison and choose their wallets over their children. So it's very devastating and scary, but it's also, it feels like we've been betrayed.
In less than a minute, would anyone else like to comment on that?
Young people are in the midst of their development. Adolescence isn't characterized as being easy without also dealing with the greatest existential threat of our time.
I definitely understand and agree with the panelists that this is something that a lot of young people stress about, and actually that's why I got into this movement to begin with in 2016, was because I thought that it was something that Americans needed to tackle, and the movement that I associated with, the conservative movement, needed to tackle as well. But the more that I've gotten into this movement, the climate change movement, the more that I've seen that this is actually a positive, that there's actually a lot of opportunity here, that we have time, science says so. That doesn't mean we don't have to act, but we do have time, and we have an opportunity and a chance for people to come together on this issue and work across party lines and generate economic growth to solve this issue. So I feel hopeful.
Great. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you all for your testimony, all of you. It really was impressive, and I very much appreciate it. Ms. Thunberg, you said, let's unite behind the science. I couldn't agree with you more. Let's unite behind the science. And I think we actually need more science, not less. Mr. Backer, you said that we need to stop this partisan fighting and actually work together to yield solutions that make sense. So you know, let me say it again. You have folks that propose this Green New Deal, yet when it's brought up for a vote, nobody votes for it. No one. You have efforts like last week to stop energy production, yet you have letters going out saying, hey, we want you to produce more oil in Middle Eastern countries and other nations that don't share American values and that have dirtier energy, that have higher emissions than in the United States. This whole thing is a charade. When you actually look at science, Ms. Thunberg, and you look at facts, the facts are, it wasn't Waxman-Markey legislation here that was designed to require emissions reduction that yielded the United States leading the world in emissions reduction. It was actually folks doing the right thing, stepping in and actually reducing emissions, through innovation, through energy efficiency, through conservation, to where we are leading the world. And in fact, we have beat the projections under Waxman-Markey, the mandatory legislation, and we've done it with cheaper energy prices. Those are the facts. Next, going to Mr. Backer, when you look at where we've actually made progress, once again, talking about last year, I worked together, Mr. Series and I and others on the Transportation Committee, where we've developed the first resiliency standard, bipartisan, unanimous bill passed out of the committee, where we dedicated record funding to resiliency and mitigation. And in the United States today, we're spending more money on climate science, technology, and energy solutions than anywhere else in the world. Those things have been done in a bipartisan manner and are actually yielding results, not the charades. These things aren't yielding anything. Ms. Thunberg, let me ask you a question. If you're sailing across the ocean and you're picking up trash along the way, and for every one piece of trash that you pick up, there's a boat right next to you dumping out 5 pieces, how would that make you feel?
First of all, we were going so fast, there wasn't enough to pick up any trash.
All right, well, if you were a slow sailor like me, how would that make you feel?
Well, first of all, if you use that logic, then I am also dumping a lot of trash in the ocean. And then I would stop dumping my trash in the ocean and tell the other boat to stop dumping their trash in the ocean as well.
And that's the important point here. I think that what we need to be doing is we need to be focusing on the countries that are dumping trash in the ocean. Of course, that's a metaphor. The fact that China is, here we are talking about reducing emissions, yet China, under the Paris Accords, are going to be increasing their emissions by nearly 50%, 5 gigatons annually. So while in the United States we need to continue investing in innovative solutions and exporting clean energy technologies, it makes no sense for us to be doing it if we're simply watching for increases in China. Mr. Backer, the IPCC report talks about numerous solutions moving forward, including clean energy and others. Under IPCC, does it contemplate only renewable energy sources moving forward?
Thank you. It actually does not. And I think that it shows a strong trend that we need to generate more clean energy going into the future. There's no doubt about that, and reduce emissions via clean energy technologies. But there's no statement in the IPCC report that says that we need to go 100% clean to reduce emissions at the level that we need to fix this problem.
So moving on from there, if moving forward, even under IPCC, it doesn't contemplate not using any conventional fuels moving forward for the next few decades anyway. Do you think it makes sense to utilize the fuels from the nation that has the cleanest energy, or do you think that it makes more sense to, for example, use Russian gas that releases 13% greater emissions as we move forward? Which makes more sense? Or do you think it makes sense to perhaps get fuels from Nigeria that just a few years ago had 2,000 ongoing spills?
I think it's important for Americans to understand that we do generate fossil fuels cleaner than anywhere else in the world, and while the rest of the world still relies on fossil fuels, that's an important thing to note. I do think while we continue to generate power for the rest of the globe and uplift people, we as a country also start transitioning more and more to clean technologies, which I think we're starting to do. But I do believe that making sure that the rest of the world is generating fossil fuels safely is important, because it's going to be a part of our future. Especially today, and the United States does do it cleaner than anywhere else in the world. That's a fact, and it's something that we have to think about.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chairwoman Castor.
Mr. Becker, in your testimony, you point out that the United States must lead by example. And despite recent emissions reductions, the United States is currently the second highest emitting country in the world annually. And although we rank #2 now, the United States is responsible for the most carbon pollution accumulated in the atmosphere. Some people say that the United States should not dramatically reduce our emissions because China and other countries aren't doing enough. I'd like to have your view on that and have each of the witnesses comment on that briefly.
Yeah, I think that's a false approach because we've never in history looked at a problem that we contribute in the United States and said, well, if it's happening somewhere else, then we shouldn't fix it. So I don't think that that's a reasonable excuse. But I also do think it's important to note that other countries are emitting and that we must hold them accountable as we hold ourselves accountable. America has led on lots of initiatives in the past. You have people in Hong Kong waving their flags and singing the American national anthem right now because we inspire them. We can do the same thing on climate change.
Yeah, I would say what you said is totally correct. The United States contributes to 25% of historic emissions in the world. And if we are the country that we say we are, if we're the leaders that we say we are, we need to lead by example here and work on what we're doing here so that the rest of the world can follow our lead.
I have a question. When your children ask you, did you do absolutely everything in your power to stop the climate crisis when the storms are getting worse and we're seeing all of the effects of the climate crisis? When they ask you, did you do everything? Can you really look them in the eye and say, no, sorry, I couldn't do anything because that country over there didn't do anything, so if they're not going to do it, then I'm not? That is shameful, and that is cowardly. And there is no excuse to not take action, to not improve as much as we can in the United States. And how can we call ourselves the city on a hill or an example for the world if we're going to be cowards and hide behind waiting for other people, saying that I'm not going to do this because they didn't? I want you to think about, this is all about being able to look your children in the eye and say, I did absolutely everything I could for you. I know that we're up against a lot of pressure. I know that the time is running out, but like honey, however you call your kids, I did everything I could. And so I just don't understand, as a parent, how can you look your kid in the eye and say, there's this impending crisis, everything is at stake, but I stood back and I didn't really do anything, I didn't take action, I didn't act like it was an emergency because our neighbors over there weren't doing it, so I'm just not going to. How can you tell your children that?
Ms. Thunberg.
I think I don't need to add anything, but just another perspective. I am from Sweden. It's a small country, and there it is the same argument. Why should we do anything? Just look at the US, they say. So just so you know, that is being used against you as well.
Chair recognizes Representative Miller.
Thank you to Chairman Castor and Ranking Member Graves, as well as to our foreign affairs counterparts, Chairman Keating and Ranking Member Kinzinger, for hosting us today. And I want to say a very special thank you to all of you for being here today and for caring so much about our Earth. Throughout our work on this committee, I have long said that any recommendations that the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis makes must ensure that we provide for innovation and not taxation. Solutions should work to reduce our carbon footprint, but not come at the detriment of increased costs for consumers. Mr. Backer, I want to thank you for your leadership and your candor. We all must do whatever we can and do our part to take care of our beautiful world. In your testimony, you discussed how we cannot regulate our way out of climate change. What are some of the ways that we can better utilize technology and increase innovation?
Thank you. If we really want to focus on reducing emissions, which I think we all agree is the end goal that we're talking about here today, it needs to be about the results, and the results can come from innovation like you're alluding to. If you look at the technologies that we can have around carbon capture, taking carbon emissions out of the air from fossil fuel emitting plants and being able to put that into the earth or reuse it for another type of product, or you look at the shifts in the transportation sector to transition to cleaner cars and cleaner technologies, that's the example of things that we can do across the globe and continue innovating. Because innovation, like I mentioned in my testimony, is something that we can export to other countries very, very easily, because it creates jobs, it's more efficient, and it ends up helping the economy. A great example of this is 194 of the world's largest companies have pledged to go 100% renewable by 2030, 2040, or even sooner than that. They're doing that because it's more cheap, it's more efficient, and it helps their consumers. It's done that because of innovation. And if we put regulations on different industries, we're not going to be solving the problem. We need to work on decarbonizing fossil fuels and reducing emissions now. And we can't do that with regulation. We can only do that through innovation. We need to innovate our way out of the climate change problem.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Vice Chairman Spanberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I hold your commitment to fighting for the future generations of this planet in the highest esteem, and I'm grateful for the attention you're bringing to these critical issues through your advocacy. Ms. Thunberg, in your speech to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on climate change, you said we are facing an existential threat, and I agree. The scientific consensus is clear. Climate change is real. Its effects, including changes to rainfall and farmers' growing seasons, sea level rise along our coasts, and exacerbation of conflicts abroad are a threat to us all. In fact, our intelligence community and 2 former secretaries of defense have cited climate change as a root cause and driver of instability and global threats, making it not just a moral imperative, but a national security imperative as well. I'm curious, in your travels as an activist and as an advocate, have you heard stories or have you engaged with those who are focused on the issues of how climate change and the instability it causes internationally are impacting security issues and how those might impact our future generations?
I have, of course, met many people who have experienced environmental and climate-related disasters and who try to help people to come back from that. And I haven't been meeting so much with people who have told me stories about it being a national security threat because I simply haven't had enough time to do that. There are so many people to meet and so many stories to hear, so I can't listen to them all, but I imagine maybe one of the others have. It doesn't seem like they have either. So maybe then you should talk to someone who is an expert in that area.
And you mentioned, apart from the security aspect of things, that you have spoken with many who have faced disasters at home due to global climate change. Could you perhaps give a couple of examples just for the committee to hear of the stories you've heard?
Yes, I have met people whose communities were simply, whose neighborhoods were destroyed by natural disasters, who were amplified by the climate crisis. I've met people whose food and water supply is being threatened by environmental or climate-related catastrophes, and it's so sad that it's so incredibly many people, so incredibly many examples that is just horrible, because so many who have experienced this and so many who are suffering from this today. And I mean, we are already seeing the consequences, unacceptable consequences of this today, and it will only get worse the longer we delay action unless we start to act now.
Thank you very much.
I would also like to add, answering that question, I would like to acknowledge that we have some Amazon protectors in the room right now who are fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest, and that is a place in the world where people are gravely suffering, not exactly from climate change itself, but from the causes of the climate crisis. The animal agriculture industry is behind, and the collusion of the animal agriculture industry with the governments of Brazil and other countries that would rather make a short-term profit than protect the lungs of our planet. The Amazon rainforest is the lungs of our planet, and that's why we're seeing these massive fires, and it is indigenous protectors like the ones here sitting who have been fighting, literally putting their bodies on the line and suffering from these fires. And I don't want to speak for them because I don't know their own stories, but I encourage you to talk to them later. But I think it's also very important that as we speak from an American perspective, we also realize that the climate crisis is global, and that even though maybe, you know, for me personally, I have Latin American roots and that my family is from Colombia, but even if you don't have those roots in Latin America, the Amazon rainforest is the lungs of our planet. And so it burning down, we must unite with Latin America, and we must unite with the indigenous activists and listen to them and give them a platform, and also not perpetuate the same systems of oppression that have been pushing them down, because it is, and I don't want to speak for this, and I don't know if Vic, you have anything to add, but it is the same systems of oppression that are causing the climate crisis that are making people feel the worst effects. To add to something that I heard earlier, I just want to say real quick, I realize my time is running out, but Albert Einstein defined insanity as trying to solve an issue with the same thinking that caused it. And right now, something that has been disturbing me a lot is seeing the way that we are trying to colonize and buy and sell our way out of a problem caused by colonization and buying and selling.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm over time. I yield back.
Representative Bertrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really don't have any prepared notes. I was sitting there just thinking, in 1977, I was confronted with a problem. My father used to grow tomatoes. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you and Vice Chairman, everybody, for allowing us to be here. I meant to do the protocol first. I apologize, but and my father used to grow these tomatoes. He'd get about a half a dozen tomatoes, and he'd put about $20 in chemicals and all kinds of nasty stuff. And I thought to myself, you know, I'm putting that stuff in my body. And I thought, there's got to be a better solution. And I stopped it's called KUB, Knoxville Utilities Board. They used to cut all the trees that were growing on the power lines, and they'd grind them up, usually about 6 o'clock in the morning, and wake us all up. And I stopped and asked one of those guys one time, I said, hey, what do y'all do with that stuff? And they said, well, we've got to realize this is 1977, okay? I was in between my 7th and 8th grade years. And he said, we take it to the landfill. And I said, well, how much do they pay you for it? And they said, we don't. We pay them to take it. And so the wheels started turning in my head. And at that point, I became a capitalist. I realized that there was money to be made. You could save the environment. At that time, it saved about 25% of the landfill space in our community. And I got into that business. But I want to, and I've realized now that of our trash stream, about 85% of that is compostable. It does not have to go into the landfill. And when it goes into the landfill, everybody just a lot of people thinks it just goes away. It doesn't go away. It creates all kinds of bad things for the environment. The gases, one of those feared gases is methane. It's when something decomposes in an anaerobic or in the absence of oxygen. So if we could compost those things, 85% of that waste stream could be turned back into soil, which would be utilized, I think, in a capitalist manner. And you wonder about capitalism. Well, I had the opportunity, I was sitting there with AOC, and I was pitching to her capitalism. I don't really know if it caught on with her or not, but my point was this. I said, you want to do away with airplanes. Well, airplane engines that put out gases that are harmful to the environment. And I said, MIT right now has an airplane engine that has no moving parts and allegedly puts nothing harmful into the environment. No moving parts. And to me, that's just Buck Rogers. But I got on YouTube and I watched the video and I watched it. You all could probably understand it, but my 55-year-old brain just doesn't understand it. But it's fascinating to me. But granted, all it did was fly a glider about the length of a football field. Well, I got to thinking, this little cell phone right here, 20 years ago, according to my friends at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, was a $100 million computer. 20 years ago. capitalism brought this. Now everybody basically has a television studio, can get to all the information in the world, can contact anybody in the world for about, I don't know, about $100 a month. And it's a pretty good deal. And that was through capitalism. And I would encourage you all to explore that, that realm of our economy. I have a piece of legislation, and I would encourage you all, I would like to hear from each one of you all what you all think about it. It's called carbon capture. It's a capitalist view of capturing carbon and utilizing it. And it's House Resolution 3861, and I would encourage you all, not now, look it up, get on your little computers. You all know how to use them better than I do. Somebody will show me when I get your email, and I would encourage you all to read that and see what it is. And I applaud you all for being here. I applaud your enthusiasm. I'm incredibly proud that you are this concerned about our environment and our world. And thank you all so much for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my 55 seconds.
Well, thank you. Representative Lujan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to all of the chairs and ranking members for bringing us together today, to all of the panelists, to our witnesses who are here with us today. I want to thank you as well. Before I begin my questions, though, I just want to remind my colleagues that those mobile phones that were once too big, or a desktop that weighed thousands of pounds, they got smaller because of federal taxpayer investment by the United States of America, investing in the research. So I hope that there's an openness and a willingness that we take the same step. Let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's make sure that we're investing those dollars and that we're answering this call. And Ms. Thunberg, I appreciate the power of your testimony. You laid it out in a document right in front of us. A document where experts and scientists have laid out the path and the road for the world to take policy action. It's simple. The work's been done for us. We just have to follow that path. So I want to thank you for that. And now I don't want to have to defend one of my colleagues as well. She can defend herself, as we all know. Congresswoman Cortez, or Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has not said that she wants to stop air travel. Her policies have said, let's do better. Let's act. And I think that that's what we're here to do. So I apologize, I took a little bit of my time to respond to some of the statements that were said earlier, but I thought it was important. So Ms. Thunberg, when I was your age, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was 350 parts per million. This year we eclipsed 415 parts per million. I'm going to try to make some sense out of this. What many scientists have said is that we only can get to 430 parts per million to get to an increase of 1.5 degrees, or be able to even hold at 1.5 degrees increase. If we get to 450 parts per million, again, we're at 415 already, that gets us to 2 degrees. Let me share what that means. With 1.5 degrees, 14% of the global population will face extreme heat. At 2%, it's 37%. At 1.5 degrees, we will see an ice-free Arctic once every 100 years. At 2 degrees, we see it every 10 years. At 1.5 degrees, our fisheries decline by 1.5 million tons, and our coral reefs decline by at least 70%. At 2 degrees, our fisheries will decline by twice that, and we'll lose 99% of our coral reefs. We see the difference between what is devastating and what is even beyond what devastating can even be described as. Ms. Thunberg, the science could not be more clear. If we wait, the climate crisis will only be more devastating. Just a year ago, you were protesting outside the Swedish parliament. Now, you are part of an international coalition of young people demanding action. I asked a few students that I have the honor of working with in New Mexico, and one of them responded. Her name is Marina Weber-Stevens. She's one of the founding members of the Global Warming Express. Anyone that's interested can find them at theglobalwarmingexpress.org. And she asked a very important question, but one that I think you have an answer to, and it's this. What is the best way to get the younger generation, teens and students involved in advocacy to address the climate crisis? And I would add to that, adults. What can we be doing How can we get more young people involved?
How we can get more young people involved, I think to just tell them the truth, tell them how it is, and because when I found out how it actually was, that made me furious, so I wanted to do something about it, and that is at least I have spoken to many, and I think that is the experience many others have. Because as it is now, people in general don't seem to be very aware of the actual science and how severe this crisis actually is. So I just think we need to inform them and start treating this crisis like the existential emergency it is. Then I think people will understand and want to do something about it.
I think that's powerful. Tell them the truth. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me begin by thanking all four of you for being here. I cannot tell you how much this builds up my confidence in the younger generation. And having you involved in this, it's extremely important that you be involved in the process. And I applaud you for being here, and I thank you for being here. I want to start with you, Mr. Backer. It's really good to see someone who's interested in such an important project, or such an important topic, I should say, and also who understands that we need to factor in the economy in this and the economic impact that something like this could have. Do you think that the state of our economy and the need to maintain a robust economy, because after all, you're all going to be participating in our economy in a way you already are, but in the future you will be even more. It's important that we have a robust economy so that we'll be able to provide jobs for young people and for all of our citizens. But do you think it's important to consider that when we're considering climate change?
Thank you, Mr. Carter, and also thank you for being a member of the Roosevelt Conservation Caucus. It's a caucus started by Republicans focused on bringing conservatives back to environmental discussions. It's a major step forward, so thank you. So the economy definitely needs to be a part of this conversation, because if we don't take the economy into consideration, we're leaving the people who are at the most risk we're keeping them at the most risk. We're allowing people who are in the lower poverty levels to be affected the most by our policies. There is an opportunity, a strong opportunity, to be economically sensible and environmentally sensible. Economic sustainability and environmental sustainability do go hand in hand. And I think a lot of people who are on this issue and believe that this is a topic that's of importance believe that the agricultural industry, corporations, and fossil fuels are a lot of the times the enemy. But they're part of our society, and they are today and they will be for the next, at least for the short term. And so if we want to lower emissions and we want to have a cleaner economy, we have to work with people instead of against people, because the only way that we're going to truly reduce emissions is to do that. And that is true with the economy, because we can't have a strong environment without a strong economy. And the worldwide statistics show, as I mentioned earlier, that the most free economies are the cleanest in the world. Does that mean that they're done and that they don't have to do more? Not in the slightest. But economic success and environmental success go hand in hand.
Okay, if I could, and I'll let you in just a second. I want to show you something on the screen if we can get it up. It's a chart that the EPA has put out that, are we going to be able to do it? Oh, just hold it up? You want me to hold it up? Okay. All right. Oh, okay. Are you going to be able to get this? Okay. Well, unfortunately, you can't see it very well. But it is a chart that the EPA put out in 2018, and it shows the growth of our economy since 1970. And the United States has actually grown our economy. Our gross domestic product has grown almost 300%. Our vehicles miles traveled has grown almost 200%. Population has grown. Energy consumption has grown. But our carbon output has decreased over that period of time. So it is possible to do. We can grow our economy and decrease our carbon output. We have done that since 1970. In fact, if you look, we've actually decreased the 6 common pollutants almost 100% since 1970 while growing our economy. So it can be done. One thing I want to make sure we understand is that, look, listen to me. This is not a Republican-Democratic issue. This is an American issue. This is a world issue. It's not United States versus China versus India. All of us have to work on this together. I believe in climate change. I believe the climate's been changing since day one. I'm old enough to remember, you're not, but I'm old enough to remember the early 70s when we thought we were headed for another ice age. Well, does man have an impact on that? Yes, we do have an impact. How much? That might be debatable. However, we should do something. And that's one of the things that I'm so excited about. And Mr. Backer, you mentioned this about the opportunities that exist here. Because I've always said we've got to have 3 things. We've got to have innovation, we've got to have mitigation, and we've got to have adaptation. And that innovation, the greatest innovators, the greatest scientists in the world are right here in the United States of America. That's why I'm excited about us leading the way. And I think we can lead the way. Yes, we've got much to be done. There's no question about that. You also mentioned about agriculture. I represent a very rural area in South Georgia. The rural community is going to play a big part in this. We cannot leave them behind. That is going to be very important as well. We have to be very careful. My message is simple, and that is that, yes, this is something we have to deal with, but we can't destroy our economy when we're dealing with it. We have to keep that in mind. We have to have affordable, reliable, clean energy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Well, thank you. As we said before, we have a hard stop. So here's what I want to just do in closing. There'll be no closing statements to allow whatever time is limited. I do want to recognize Representative Brownlee, who's been here paying great attention throughout the whole hearing, Representative Levin, Representative Titus, Representative Omar, in the case that we may not have the opportunity because you do have to leave. So I'll now recognize Representative Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this very, very timely and important hearing. Climate change is undoubtedly an economic threat. That's true. A national security threat. That's true. And ultimately, and most importantly, an existential threat. It has battered our coast, set our forest ablaze. In my home state, Mr. Barrett's home state of New York, Superstorm Sandy destroyed the property and uprooted the lives of thousands of New Yorkers, including many living in my district. If left unabated, climate change will displace world populations. Islands, Mr. Barrett, you're correct, will be gone where people currently live. And it will continue to wreak havoc on our own, costing billions in damage. That's economics. If we're not prepared, there will be billions of dollars that will cause economic damage if we don't do something about climate change. It will also, climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of progress in development, in global health, and poverty reduction. So we've got to do something urgently. If the world that we leave behind, and we all hold this world in trust for the next generation. So I look at it, the world that I leave behind for my new baby granddaughter will look dramatically different if we do nothing today. Indeed, a drastic reduction in our carbon footprint will be one of, if not the most important, missions of our time. I also want to say, and I heard Ms. McGolan say this a number of times, I just want to let you know that anxiety research indeed shows that young people have high levels of anxiety. It isn't, though, just because of climate change. Everything from the economics to health disparities, to student loans, etc., of course, climate change is compounding that problem. But what you are doing by being here and leading does make a difference. And I just used the example of one of my colleagues who at 16 years old helped change and shape a nation. His name was John Lewis. He put his life on the line. He had a lot of anxiety if you talk to him. But by doing this with that anxiety and turning that anxiety into something that you are going to lead to change, it makes the world a better place for all of us. So I compliment you on how you are using your anxiety to make a difference in the world. That is something that is so important. And indeed, yes, all young folks. I'm old enough to remember the civil rights movement when it was led by students and high school students who said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And they changed things. So believe this, that each and every one of you, Mr. Backer, I've been listening to you. You are part of a change that's going to make us all better, to make this nation and this world better. One of the things we'll fight back and forth, but guess what? I still bet on America. We'll go through some of the bad times, because Lord knows I've seen bad times, and I've seen us come through it. So I want to say to each and every one of you, don't give up on America, because what America is all about is that if we stand up and fight, if we stand up for what we believe in, we will change things. It does make a difference. It is the reason why I can sit here, Mr. Barrett, because I've seen my father go through some terrible times as an African American, and then I saw Barack Obama become president of the United States. Not just for black folks, but for all folks. Keep up your work. You will make this place we call Earth not only exist, but thrive and be a better place. And I yield back.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your extraordinary testimony. It makes a difference. It will make a difference. And by the way, it's bipartisan and based on science. Thank you for being here. We also want to thank Representative Costa, who's been here too, as well. So you stayed later than you agreed to. I know how hard-pressed you are. So if I could just ask those in the audience and the press, allow the witnesses to go to the anteroom where we came in from so that you can get to your next place more quickly. So please remain seated. Allow the witnesses to go to the anteroom so that they can have an expedited way back to their next meeting, which they agreed to stay longer to hear our testimony. With that, I adjourn this hearing. Thank you.